Yes.
Yes.
Right, good. Sorry. Okay, right. Yeah, as you can see from this, this is a poster from a chainsaw company, which I've pinched. So there's probably all sorts of copyright issues here. But basically, I'm sure you're all aware, because you're all woody people, that trees usually put on annual rings. Not always the case, as I'll say in a moment. But the important thing for us to consider at the moment is that the tree is writing a diary of its life as it goes through. So everything under the sun has happened to this poor old tree. It starts off here growing quite nicely as a nice little seedling. And then after a few years, something happens. Maybe the tree next door falls into it and makes it go sideways. Maybe there's a bit of an earth slip or whatever. Trees don't like growing sideways, so it puts on more wood on one side so that it goes upright again. And then we've had changes in the competition regime of the trees around it when trees are thinned out. Might be a forest fire, there might be drought, insect attacks. All these things are affecting the trees. So you can see here that we've got periods of good growth. We've got periods here when growth is badly affected and it grows very slowly for a while, picks up more slowly and so on. So the tree's writing a diary of its life there. And I said, you know, we're all used to the idea that trees put on annual rings. This is a slice through a bit of mahogany. You can see sort of various density variations within this, but it doesn't have easily discernible rings. So that would be obviously pretty hopeless for dendrochronology. But other problems that we have, here's a slice of tree where you can see we've got nice big fat rings, and as you follow it around the radius, they begin to dive down and get very narrow. And I don't think there's actually a case on this one of a ring disappearing, but what can happen is that they look as if they're fusing together. So it's a bit like contours on a cliff face, they all come together. So if you took a small core from this tree, if you took it through this part, if you took it through that part, you'd get a nice clear ring sequence. If you took it up through here, you might come up even with a different number of rings. So life is not easy, but I'm going to be talking about mostly things that are easy. So I said that every tree is doing its own thing with all those appalling disasters that struck it, like fire and drought and all the rest of it. But if we think of a large number of trees over a wide geographical area, then they're all subject to the same weather conditions in a year, so that trees of the same species, at least, over quite a wide area, should have similar sorts of reactions in growth over that area. And one confusion here is this little horrible word you can see at the bottom here called autocorrelation, which simply means that the tree is reacting to its own conditions, if you like. If you think of a human, in a normal winter, when we actually get to meet each other and see people and hug them and things, you might pick up a cold from somebody. If you're a good, healthy, strapping person who goes to the gym every week and is very healthy, that cold might make you feel rough for a couple of days and then you just get over it. If you're a very weak person and you've got some other horrible disease or something, then that same cold might impact on you greatly and you might actually be bedridden for a few days. And it's the same with trees. If the tree is basically growing healthily, then the conditions in one year might not impact on it as much as if the tree was suffering in other ways. So we get similar patterns, but it's going to be slightly different for each tree. Now, I know we've got a lot of international visitors tonight, which is nice to see, but I am afraid going to be talking mostly about conditions in Britain. And these wiggly lines represent oak growth in 3 different parts of Britain. So Cheshire is up in the northwest, Hampshire's in the central southern coastal area, and Essex is just to the northeast of London. So there's probably 150 kilometers or so between these, maybe probably more than that actually. They're separated by, let's say, a couple of 100 kilometers. And this is the common growth in ring width. This is ring width over time. And you can see that in the 3 areas that are quite distant apart, there are years in which they're all doing the same thing. So this red line here connects rings where all of the trees in these 3 different areas are all having a good year, putting on a wide ring. Equally here, they're all having a very narrow ring immediately followed by a wide ring. And so you can build up common years, a bit like this, turns out looking a bit like a barcode. And there are other lines I could draw in here, but you know, obviously they're going to be doing their own things. They're going to have slightly different weather conditions in different parts of the country, but there are a significant number of years where they're all doing the same things, which means that we can match ring width patterns across that wide area. And that is the basis of dendrochronology as a dating tool. So if we assume that that is true, which I hope I've convinced you that it is, we can build up a long chronology of tree rings for a particular species. So here we've got our nice oak tree, and you wouldn't just have one, of course, you'd have hundreds of these, and you'd take the mean of their growth patterns to filter out all that individual tree bit of disease and fire and drought and all those horrible bits. And you'd end up with a pattern that represents trees over a large area, going back from the present back into the past, with something like an oak tree in Britain, maybe 150, 200 years. And if we want to build this up and use it as a dating tool, we obviously need an older source of wood. So if we go to an old building and we extract data from the old building, and I'll say how we do that a bit later, then hopefully you can overlap the outer rings of your old building with the inner rings of your living trees, and you can therefore assign a calendar date to all those rings, and you can go on doing that back through history for as long as you've got a good number of specimens that you can call on. So you can build up a long chronology, which is the basis of your dating, so that any new material you should be able to slot into that. Sounds very easy. It's not as easy in practice, of course, and hopefully come up with a date. One other important aspect of this, which I'm not going to say too much on, but we might come back to at the end, is the basis that dendrochronology has for radiocarbon dating. I'm sure you've all heard of radiocarbon dating. It's the way of dating just about anything that has lived in the past. But what a lot of people don't realize is that it is totally dependent on tree rings and dendrochronology to produce the calibration curve. This is not a lecture on radiocarbon, but I do need to say that it is the fundamental basis of radiocarbon dating. You take dated pieces of wood that you've done through dendrochronology, subject them to analysis, and you can then work out the fluctuations that there have been in radiocarbon in the atmosphere in the past. As I say, we might come back to that a little bit at the end. So to be useful for dendrochronology, we need to have species that are long-lived, because we need to be able to overlap those patterns and be sure that we've got an overlap that is meaningful. We also need to have a species that has clear rings. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is going to be talking about oak. Other species, things like birch, you can see rings in them, but even under the microscope, it can sometimes be very, very difficult to pick out the ring boundaries with certainty. And they're really, I mean, I have actually seen somebody did a PhD on birch in northern Norway, and good luck to them. It must have been awful. But yeah, the clearer the rings, the easier it is, and you like to have a lot of them. And if we're going to use it as a dating tool, then we need to have a source of that material going back beyond the life of trees that are living now, so that we can build up these long chronologies and use it as a basis for dating. And we're very lucky, again, I'm going to talk, as I say, mostly about oak. We're very lucky that oak has been used by populations for thousands of years. And let's just have a look at a piece of oak. Here's a cross section of a core of oak, and you can see the rings very clearly. Here we've got spring vessels that form in Britain, they form sort of probably late April, early May, and they go on till perhaps the middle of June or so, and then it gives way to this much more fibrous late wood, which grows throughout the summer. And then, of course, the leaves drop off late in the autumn and growth ceases, and then you get another year following on. The second most common building timber in England is elm. And I've actually just published a paper on trying to date elm, where I've basically proved that you can very rarely do it. This is an exceptional case of a building that's close to where I am in Essex, to the northeast of London, where I did actually manage to get some elm to date against oak in the same building. But that is exceptional. I've looked at probably over 100 buildings now, and there are about 4 cases in the whole of Britain in the last 40 years where my colleagues or I have managed to date elm, and some of those I'm a little bit concerned about. So yeah, not a good species. The other main thing that we get here in Britain is imported pine, and these are cores from some pine from building timbers where the pine came from southern Sweden. So we can date imported timber because we can talk to our friends abroad and get their chronologies. This is, if any of you are interested, just a number of the imported pines we have. This first one looks a bit earlier than the rest, but there's actually some material missing. So from about the 1630s onwards in Britain, we get pine imported. It's put into some of the most prestigious buildings to begin with, royal palaces and castles and things like that. And then as you go through time, it becomes more and more common, so that when you get back to, say, 150 years ago, it's actually so common that it's used in terraced houses for the poor. Okay, so as I say, we overlap these things and we match them. It's important that we have a good enough match, and everybody always wants to know, well, how long is that? Well, if you talk to a mathematician, to a proper statistician, they're going to say you need at least 50 years, and they'd probably be happy with any more than that. There's no sort of absolute boundary number of years, but as a practicing dendrochronologist, I hope my colleagues would bear me out here, we like to have at least 60 to 80 years, and the more the merrier, basically. The problem that we have is that even though oak is a fantastic species, here are 2 bits of oak. You can see here that the top one has lots of lovely rings, lots of ring variation. There's some wide rings there, some narrower ones, lots of rings in quite a short space. Below, this is also oak, but you can see that it has very wide rings, and there's not a lot of variation. This is a tree that grew in a nice fertile area. It had plenty of water, plenty of nutrient. Nothing was particularly limiting its growth from year to year. It's what we call complacent. It has very little variation. And so you can see that if you've got a building timber that's that size, you might have 150 rings in it, or you might have 35 or 40 rings in it. And so it doesn't depend on size, it depends on the number of rings, whether it's useful to us for dating or not. And horrible things graphs, they put a lot of people off, but just to emphasize that, here we got various categories of numbers of rings, and you can see down here when we've got fewer than 50 rings, the white bar is the undated portion of number of samples. Most of samples of 50 or fewer rings, very few of them date. The more rings you get, the greater that proportion of blue, the greater the chances of dating. So that when we get up to sort of 90 or 100 rings, a very large proportion of those samples will date. So we're always looking for rings. That's the important bit. As I say, size doesn't always matter. This is, I think, the smallest sample I've ever dated. It's about 7 centimeters. It had 56 rings and it dated. Quite a funny story behind this one, actually. My colleague Dan Miles, who I do a lot of work with, he and I were working together in Wales, and we were looking at a lovely old cottage. I climbed up in the roof where it had massive timbers, sort of 200 millimeters and more, square, big rafters and things. And I was crawling around looking at these, muttering and cursing because they didn't have enough rings for dating. And my colleague Dan was standing on a ladder looking through the hatch. And he said, that partition wall that you've just crawled through, have a look at the laths that have been cut off where they've made a hole in that wall. And I did, and this was one of them. And it dated, it was the only thing in there that did. So, you may have a single sample. If it's got enough rings, it may date. Sometimes that's all you've got. Sometimes you're just presented with one piece of wood and say, can you date it? And well, if you're very lucky, you might, if it's got a good number of rings. But if you think back to that first slide that I showed, a single tree has got all the odd things that have happened to that tree, like being damaged or diseased or being cut and managed in some way and having atypical growth. So your chances of dating a single tree are quite small. There are all sorts of things that can befall it. This is a small core through another oak. And you can see in this portion on the left-hand side here in this early bit, there are early wood vessels, but they're all running into each other. You cannot pick out individual rings in this. And this is a tree where insect defoliation was happening year after year after year. As soon as the leaves came out, insects were nibbling them off and the tree was barely surviving. In fact, in this woodland, a third of all the trees in the woodland died during this period. And this was one of the survivors. And you can see that on the right-hand side here, it begins to grow, the insect populations die, and you begin to see individual rings. So it carried on, but you couldn't date that. The other problem is that because oak in particular has been used by humans for thousands of years, we've also managed it and looked after it. And you're probably all familiar with this coppicing here, where you cut down to the rootstock and let it grow, and you use these small shoots for fuel, for fires, for feeding your animals perhaps, or for making small tool handles and fencing and that sort of thing. The root remains and it grows on. One alternative to doing that is that you cut the tree at a much higher level at head height, which is known as pollarding, and the same thing happens, it shoots and grows away. You do that so that these fresh branches are out of the way of grazing animals. And there's another form which we call shredding, which is effectively the same thing. This is in northern France, where you see that they've left the trunk of the tree here and trimmed off the side branches. Can you imagine going up there and trimming those branches off? You'd have to be slightly mad, I think. But anyway, it's another form of management. And the impact that that has on growth, you end up with a slice of wood like this, where the growth is nice and happily on the bottom left here, it's growing away quite happily. And then somebody's come along and cut those branches. So growth slows down to almost nothing, picks up again, recovers, and then it's cut, recovers, cut, recovers, cut, and so on. So you have this periodic growth that's nothing to do with the weather, and there's no way that you can date a sample like that. The other important thing is that if you've got a good sample, you actually measure it properly. It sounds very simple and silly to say, but it is worth just mentioning that you do have to be really careful. The red and the black lines here represent two trees growing in the same area, showing the same sort of growth. You can see it's not perfect. That one has a wide ring the year before this one. Some of you may be old enough to remember, I certainly do, 1976, when we had a very hot, dry summer across the whole of Northwest Europe. And that produced a narrow ring in most trees. So it's a year that stands out. But you can see that there's common growth between those two. If you happen to just make a mistake in your measurement so that you misidentify one ring and you shift those patterns by 1 year, you can see that you just get a confusing load of nonsense and it doesn't work at all. So that's just to emphasize the care that's needed in the work. So, excuse me, I'm going to have to cough. I said that you may get a single tree, a single sample if you're lucky to date, but can you really do anything from an archaeological point of view with that date? It might be a tree that's been stockpiled, a tree that was left over from another job and sitting around for years before it was used. It could be a timber that has been used before. Timber's a valuable commodity, so it gets reused. You might pull down an old building and say, oh, that's a good bit of timber, I'll use that again 100 years later. Or it might be a repair in a building. And so if you get a single date for a single piece of timber, you really have to be careful about the interpretation of what that means. So what we want to do as dendrochronologists is that we're very greedy. We want to get lots of samples of what we think is the same phase of I'm talking buildings here mostly, it could be an archaeological context or whatever, several samples, because if we match them to each other, we can filter out all that individual tree data, and we can hopefully get a more meaningful representation of the growth. But also we can make sure that they're all telling us the same story, all coming up with the same date, and then we can believe it. And finally, we need to know how to interpret any dates that we do get. And that's dependent on sapwood. Again, you're probably all tree people. I don't need to tell you much about this, but sapwood, of course, is the living bit of the tree around the outside. The center of the tree is quite often dead, which is why you can have a hollow tree that's quite successfully growing away. But in terms of using this as a dating exercise, we need to know that we're at the outside of a tree. If you've just got a bit of timber with 100 rings in and date, well, is that the 100 rings from the inside of a 300-year-old tree, or is it close to the date when the tree was cut down? So I've been talking about building timbers. What we usually do is to take out cores, and you can see here's a representation of some cores that I've taken from a building. Good number of rings, lots of variation and dates, but you can see here, hopefully, and I'll highlight that, the sapwood on the outside. So if we blow that up, this top one here, you can probably see a slight variation in color from this point onwards to the right, and it's all worm-eaten and holy, so that we know we've got to the sapwood, but we haven't got much of it. That doesn't matter, because we know we've got to this sapwood boundary. We can add on a reasonably good estimate of what we might expect to find. And that's going to vary in different parts of the country. Where I am here in this part of the world, 95% of the oak trees are going to have between 9 and 41 rings. I'm sad that I've counted so many that I can tell you that. But what we're looking for is the ideal situation that we have on the bottom core here, where again, you can see here the change, the variation in color to sapwood. And here we've got a complete number of sapwood rings out to where the bark sat. And because of the anatomy of this oak, we can even see here that the tree was cut down in summer or possibly autumn of the year. So we haven't got a complete ring there. And then, of course, we got the problem of, well, you might be able to tell when the tree was cut down, but how do you know that's when it was used? And again, I'm talking mostly about buildings. What you can see in a building is, of course, you're going to cut your beams nice and square. And you do this when the tree's young and just freshly cut, when it's in a green state. And of course, subsequently, it will dry. So it will crack and it will distort. And it distorts in slightly different ways depending on how it's being cut. And if you look in your building, you can usually see these distortions. So you know that the tree was used very quickly after it was cut down. So if you date the felling of the tree, you've effectively dated the construction within 1, 2, 3 years, something like that. So if we look at this case here, this is a barn that I worked on many years ago. We've got a group of, sadly, only 4 timbers. We can identify the heartwood-sapwood boundary on them, so we can give an estimate of when those were likely to have been cut down. And we can tell that this part of the barn was probably put up in the 1550s or 60s. In the other part of the barn, we've got another nice group of timbers, all with similar heartwood-sapwood boundary dates. But in this case, we've got one timber only with complete sapwood. And that was a tree that was cut down there in the spring. And we can tell, therefore, that, well, it's quite likely that they were all cut down that same year. So we can date that phase very precisely within a year or so. Here we're looking at an estimate of when the trees were cut. So the first thing we do is to say we match these to each other, try and filter out all that individual tree variation. So we get a good representation of growth that's due to the weather, and then we put that into our database, that long chronology that we've built up, and we try and match it. And we do that in 2 ways. We do that statistically, so that you've got an objective method that you can show to other people and see if they agree with you or not. And we do it visually. We actually use these graphs of things. Statistics can throw up odd matches that aren't actually true, and it's easier to sort those out when you look at the graphs. And that's where the experience comes in. A lot of people just latch onto the statistics and come up with some complete nonsense occasionally, but there you are. And here, this is the sort of slide that you should never show as a professional because it's got too much information on it. But basically, the point I want to make is that well, certainly in Britain, we tend to use t-values. It's not the only way of doing it, but it's a statistical match. We've got here a number of chronologies that have been made, some by me, some by other people. So there should be a lot of independent chronologies that have been built here of individual sites. And we've got good numbers of rings overlapping. And if we take this particular example that I've got here, if the outer ring is taken as 1470, it's giving these t-values against all these independent chronologies. And a t-value of about 3.5 or above is statistically significant. So here we've got all telling the same story with good t-values, and basically I'd be prepared to stand up in court and swear on my life and reputation, such as it is, that that was the date that the trees were cut. And this can help in many ways. This is a lovely church tower, a wooden church tower, not far from where I live, actually. Building historians have been arguing about the date of this tower for years. In fact, there are publications going back through the middle of last century, which give various ranges of dates covering about a 250-year period. So you can tell that even building historians who often usually know exactly what they're talking about got confused by this building. This photo here, you don't really get a sense of the size of these timbers. They're about 300 millimeters across at this point. They're huge. And I was asked in to see if I could date this and end this controversy about how old it was. I took 6 of these timbers. Ideally, I'd like to have more, but you know, somebody has to pay for this work, and it was a parish with not a lot of money. So I regarded those 6 as being enough because they had mostly over 100 rings. But the first thing I noticed when I tried to match them to each other is that they didn't match very well. And that suggests to me that they probably came from different sources. And that's probably not unreasonable because they are so big. They're just not the sort of thing you can go to your local woodland and get. They probably had to search around to get these trees. And that's also perhaps shown by the fact that I found that they were felled over 3 successive years in the winters here, 1397-8, 1398-9, and 1399-1400. So I'm suggesting that the tower was probably built in 1400. If I'd taken a few more samples, I may have found one from 1401 or whatever, but I pinned it down to within 2 or 3 years, just around 1400, maybe 1401, 1402. And that ended a lot of this controversy where people had put dates on it, as I say, from about 1300 up to nearly 1500. So that was quite useful. Another bit of an aside here, there are lots of sites that I've done around this area within 25 kilometers, secular sites, non-church or ecclesiastical sites, and it didn't match those particularly well. What it did match were sites that I have that are monastic or ecclesiastical from various counties around, and again, apologies to those of you who are not from Britain, but we're looking at sites probably up to 140, 150 kilometers away that had these monastic or ecclesiastical connections. And myself and a number of my colleagues have found this. The church was obviously looking after its wood in a different way, probably letting it grow for longer, and you can tell the management because of the similarity in the rings. Bit of an aside. Another example here, this is this bit in the middle here. This is the so-called Queen's House in the Tower of London, which is where the guy in charge of the tower, whatever he's called, the constable of the tower, I think it is, or the governor, whichever, he lives in this splendid building. And there was a lot of work done on this just a few years ago. And building historians went in and did a fabric analysis throughout this wing. It's an L-shaped building, as you can see, and there are lots of different roofs. And they concluded that it was built in 3 different phases. I must admit, when my colleague Dan and I went and looked at this, we sort of rubbed our head a bit and thought, why did they think that? But that's not my problem, that's theirs. When we did the dendro on this, we took samples throughout all these different roofs around the L shape, and we showed that the trees were all cut down in roughly the same time. So the yellow hatching on here represents the sapwood. We've got a few here with estimated dates, but we've got plenty where they actually had complete sapwood. So we've got a number of timbers cut in the winter of 1538-9 and the following spring, found throughout. There's one bit here where maybe it was a little bit earlier. We've got one there from winter 1536-7. But basically, all those roofs were telling the same story. All the trees cut at the same time, and we suspect it was all built pretty much in one go. Another example, a place called Motisfont Abbey in Hampshire, again, central southern England, has got a number of roofs of different styles. I'm not going to go into these now. Most of you are into buildings will realize that these are very different. A wagon roof, a steep pitch truss framed roof, and a low pitch king post roof. And therefore, it was suggested that these roofs are probably all different dates because they're different styles. And there was a question of were these pre or post dissolution when the churches were busted up by Henry VIII. In fact, the dendro here shows that all three roofs were built in, again, this period 1538-39, following the sale of the property at the time of the dissolution. The abbey that was there was broken up and sold to this guy, Lord Sands. So again, the dendrochronology was the only way where you could pick these differences out and give that resolution. I've talked about sapwood. I'm just very quickly going to gloss over this. My colleague Dan Miles did his PhD on this, sorry, his DPhil because he was at Oxford, a few years ago. I said that usually we take this sort of estimate in this part of the country where I am, 95% of the trees are going to have between 9 and 41 sapwood rings. You can actually get a better estimate for individual trees based on the age of the tree and the rate of growth of the tree. So he developed this model whereby you can see here we've got a probability curve for the likely number of sapwood rings and the period that they cover for each individual timber. So that you can see is slightly longer and flatter than this tree, which had a different growth rate and a different age. And if we look at a batch of timbers where we haven't got complete sapwood, and we apply these individual estimates to those individual trees, then we can sort of sum these probabilities, if you like. And the next slide shows that if you take that as a group, then this is the most likely period. If you put all of those together, you can narrow this down to just a 10-year period where those trees were most likely cut. And in fact, because this was an Oxford college, they actually had the records, and the date when the tree was, when this roof was built actually falls right in the middle of that group. So this is just a mathematical way of pinning down that range so that we can get more accurate dates when we don't have the complete sapwood. Okay, this is a slide I've pinched from another of my dendrochronological friends. This shows the sort of numbers of dates that we have for buildings across England. And you can see that obviously the further you go back in time, the fewer buildings we have. So we don't have many pre-13th century buildings. But as you come on through history, we get more and more and more. And then it tails off at this end, because usually by the time you get up to buildings of this age, people know there are either written records or the style is such that you can pin down the dates very accurately. So people don't need to know, they just don't call us in to look at these buildings. And we actually like to get them because it means we've got a continuous set of data and we can strengthen our data. But most of the buildings that we're looking at are late medieval or immediately post-medieval. And as time goes on and we accumulate more and more data, we can obviously date things that we didn't used to be able to. This is an example of a roof I looked at in a little place just to the north of London. It's got what we call a crown post roof here. I looked at this back in 2002, and I got some statistical matches at 1340, but they weren't very strong and they weren't very replicated. And I didn't let it out as a date. I just said, I'm sorry, I can't date this building. But I was asked to reassess this just a couple of years ago. I got two timbers that matched each other and gave a 90-year sequence. And because I've built up a database of a lot more places since 2002, when I looked at this in 2017, I found that I got a lot more and a lot stronger, statistically, a lot stronger matches at that same 1340 date, which is a relief. And I'm now happy to actually say that, yes, that was the felling date. Whereas back in 2002, I wasn't happy to say that. Now I am quite happy to say that. So the more data you accumulate, the more results you're likely to get. And when this whole thing becomes interesting, of course, is when you can start to put all this data together. So this book here by my good friend Edward Roberts, who I spoke to on the phone just today, actually, produced this fantastic book about Hampshire houses and their development. And in that, myself and Dan Miles have dated over 200 buildings now, and at least 300 phases of buildings. And that's more than any other county in Britain. And because we've got this fantastic database, what Edward was doing was looking at the carpentry, looking at the types of joints, the way that framing was put together and so on. And you can now put a proper time frame against that, so that when you find a building that doesn't have timber that's suitable for dating, you can date it stylistically very well against this collection of houses in that area. And it's important to say in that area, because even though Britain is a very small country, you only have to move 100 miles away and you might have a completely different set of building types. So you can't take the knowledge that you've gained in one area and necessarily apply it in another area, which is a problem to me because I dash around all over the country looking at buildings and make an idiot of myself pronouncing what date I think it is before I've got the dendro date, and often turn out to be completely wrong because I'm comparing it with something I know in a different part of the country. Another example, a collection this time of what we call Cruck Buildings, where you use these bent pieces of timber to form a sort of A-frame cruck. And Nat Alcock, Dan Miles produced this book on Cruck buildings in the Midlands of England. And this has, I think, that has over 100 buildings in it that have been dated, and again allows us to look at the development of that type of carpentry, which you only find in one particular region. Don't find this where I live in the extreme east of England, so that's quite interesting and different. More work that I've been involved in North Wales, a lot of stone building in North Wales, in Snowdonia, and a lot of architectural historians, particularly the more academic ones, always a bit snooty about this area. It's out in North Wales, which is quite a long way from London, and therefore everybody assumed that this is rural and they're all backward and they all get their ideas from London, and therefore these buildings were probably 50 years after everybody else had done them. What we found out when we got some dates on them is actually very interesting. They developed a type of building known as the Snowdonian House, which was a sort of innovative plan form. They developed it about half a century earlier than had been assumed, and they were the first people in the country to come up with this plan form that then spread away from there. So that was sort of one in the eye for the really academic people who thought it was the edge of civilization, and it turns out to be a hub of innovation. Excuse me. Don't just do whole buildings, sometimes do things like doors. This is a door in a church not far from where I live, in a place called Hadstock, which is in North Essex. The stonework around this door is dated by the stonework experts at about 1060. The door, we got rings up to, I think, 1024 with no sapwood, but it would appear that therefore it's likely that that door dates to 1060 to 70. That door is still in daily use. So it's been there 1,000 years, which is stunning, I think. That's just a bit of nonsense from the Bayer tapestry, just something that looks similar. Sorry, just being silly there. This actually turned out to be the oldest door so far dated in this country. This is in Westminster Abbey. It's known as the Pyx door. It's not actually in its original position. It's been cut down and slipped in there. But this one we did find sapwood on. So we were able to give an estimated felling date for the timber to make this door of between 1032 and 1064. The people who know the Abbey well reckon that this was in a phase of the Abbey that was built in the 1050s, which fits very nicely with that. And so that door is probably 10 years older than the last one I showed you, which really upset the people in the church where I dated the previous one. And people always want to have the oldest. I mean, the fact that we've got two doors from the 11th century, I think we should just get excited and think wondrously about, never mind if one's 10 years older than the other or not. Who cares? I want to quickly, how am I doing on time? Rabbiting on too long as usual. I want to say something very quickly about dendro provenancing, which is trying to find out where the trees grew. This is a small example of Salisbury Cathedral, timbers in the eastern chapel roofs of Salisbury Cathedral that we know were consecrated, the chapel was consecrated in 1225. Basically, the dots on here, the bigger the dot and the more red the dot, the stronger the similarity between the curves that we get from the tree rings. The smaller and the bluer the dots, the worse the matching between them. So here's our site here. You'd assume that the timber probably came from round here. In fact, it almost certainly came from Ireland. And when people dug into the records, they found that the Bishop of Salisbury had actually had an argument with local landowners, which is why he went off and bought his timber in from Ireland. So it's quite useful if you can tell where the timber came from. Another example of that, this is a lovely church chest in a church in Suffolk that I dated a few years ago. The carving on this is very similar to the stone carving in the church itself. So it's an English church chest in an English church with carving that's the same as the stonework, and everybody assumed, English wood. Doesn't date against English material. Luckily, many years ago, we started getting, and Thomas Fajny is with us tonight, I see in the list, he produced a lot of material from what is modern day Poland, which was probably part of Prussia then. My history is not that good. But we imported this board. In the third quarter of the 14th century, we imported that board, and then it was carved here and made into this fantastic chest. So we can do that by matching our tree ring patterns. So dendrochronology can give us very precise dates if we've got suitable material. It can give us a very sound framework for dating stylistically, and it can indicate the possible source area for the trees used. And that might have been a good place to stop, but I did want to throw in a bit extra for some of those who know about dendrochronology to begin with. So very quickly, I'm going to run through this. We're now beginning to look at oxygen isotopes, and we've supplied the group at Swansea, Professor Neil Loader and his colleagues at Swansea University, with dated pieces of wood. And they have looked at oxygen isotope chronologies based on that. And it's very labor intensive. They have to cut up the individual rings and submit those to analysis in a machine that goes bing and comes out with an answer. And here's an example of where we had very poor cores for standard dendrochronology. So not terribly many rings, and this complacent growth again, you can see not much variation in ring width. Went to look at this building in South Wales years ago and said, sorry, we can't date that. It doesn't have enough rings. There's not enough variation. It's unsuitable for standard dendrochronology. It's a fantastic grade 1 listed building. Stylistically, it was dated between 1480 and 1580, which is a huge range. It's described as one of the finest surviving medieval hall houses in Wales. Dendro dates, as I say, couldn't get them, so we submitted them to this oxygen isotope. And the results that the Swansea people got were, this is all the noise of possible matches, but they've got this one standout date here that matches beautifully with very high precision, that the tree was cut down in 1420. So this is a whole new way, when we can't use standard dendrochronology, that we might be able to get results in the future. So that's very exciting for oak. We also tried this with this dated piece that, remember that I had this elm that dated very rarely from a building in Essex. They tried the same process. They did come up with a spike here. Statistically, that is not separate enough from the noise around it for them to have been sure. They wouldn't have, if this was all they had, they wouldn't have declared that as a date. But because it had already exceptionally been dated by dendrochronology, that is actually the right date. So it's quite interesting that we might be able to use this new technique of isotopes on different species of wood. And just very quickly to round off, radiocarbon, which I mentioned earlier, has improved significantly lately. They used to take 5 or 10-year blocks of wood to do the analysis to look at the variation in the atmosphere of radiocarbon through time. They've now realized that there are individual years where you get a spike in radiocarbon. So what they've just done is a thing called International Calibration Curve 2020, published just last year, where they've taken individual years of blocks of wood of 1 year and subjected those to analysis. So this is a building in Suffolk that I looked at years ago. I did get some tentative statistical matches. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 timbers that matched each other and gave about a 90-year chronology here. But I wasn't happy that it dated. I got very weak matches. I got weak matches at, I think it was 1609. But if you take 2 of these samples, so sample 5 here with the complete sapwood and sample 9 here that goes back further in time, if you take individual rings of that a known number of years apart and subject those to radiocarbon analysis, where it cut, I'm not going to go into radiocarbon greatly, but you can get various probabilities scattered throughout time of when that radiocarbon date was likely to be. But because you know the precise number of years apart, you can model the most likely part in these. And we can tell that the trees were actually cut down in 1609, which was the date that I had from conventional dendrochronology, but wasn't sure about because it wasn't a very strong match. You don't have to have a conventional date to do that. As long as you know the number of years apart, you should these days, because they've got this new annual resolution, you should be able to get a radiocarbon date to within about 11 years. So I shall shut up now, stop sharing my screen and let you all recover and ask me some questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Martin. Fantastic.